Welcome to Ferment Radio. I am your host, Aga Pokrivka, and my guest today is Salla Sariola. Salla is a social scientist at the University of Helsinki, Finland. In this episode, we will talk about her research on microbes as social actors and the implications of antimicrobial resistance, which happens, for example, when microorganisms are immune to antibiotics. Salla is also passionate about fermenting vegetables and dairy, as well as permaculture composting.
My name is Salla Sariola. I'm working at the University of Helsinki. I run a research group, Social Study of Microbes, which is a kind of world-unique research group developing this line of research concerning looking at microbes from a social, scientific, sociological perspective. One strong strand within that work is concerning fermentation. We also look at other things that include, for example, social aspects of antimicrobial resistance, and that's also something we can discuss.
I kind of have an imagination that usually fermentation, it is so that it's something which comes from personal practice and then it extends towards maybe more professional or work environment. Was it similarly for you?
Yes and no. I was working in a department of population health in Oxford some years ago, where I was working with global health researchers as a social scientist and someone who was interested in bioethics, researching on topics on global health bioethics, which as a field of research took me to, for example, Kenya and Vietnam and India, working with global health researchers, so biomedical researchers and epidemiologists, and having sort of these colleagues working on pressing health issues, I learned how concerned they were about antimicrobial resistance. So bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics to the point that we can no longer, if microbes are no longer reacting to antibiotics, can no longer cure infectious diseases or perform very common operations where antibiotics are used to prevent from kind of more dangerous infections. So if antibiotics don't work, the doctors will worry that our medicine will go back 100 years because antibiotics are so crucial to the way in which Western medicine is practiced. And so through these collaborations with biomedical researchers, I kind of the scale of the concern about antimicrobial resistance became really apparent to me, and I realized also that there were very few social scientists working in this fight against the resistance. But that's again repeating a kind of war type metaphor about microbes, when microbes are so much more complex and complicated and have other roles as well. I realized that, though there are all these biological mechanisms that cause microbes to become resistant, they're very much connected to or caused by human practice, or overuse of antibiotics, or people having to use antibiotics in replace of healthcare because they don't have healthcare access. And so these are the reasons underlying or driving antimicrobial resistance are very much to do with humans. And so from that perspective, it just seemed so bizarre that there weren't more social scientists going like, hey, look, biomedics cannot solve this alone. You need to understand health systems, you need to understand the role of development in driving antibiotic use, what are the socio-behavioral, economic reasons, or what is at stake for people if they can't use antibiotics. Their livelihoods are at stake, they can't grow their cattle in the same way that they're used to. And so there are lots of things. There's so many reasons why social scientists should be involved. The more I thought about microbes, the more I realized that somehow microbes were absolutely fascinating. So then for me, it started to look like the world is heading towards a catastrophe when it comes to antimicrobial resistance, and that there are going to be huge changes in terms of how healthcare is practiced, but how people live with their animals when they can't pump their food with antibiotics and so on. So we're going to be looking at changes in the way that we relate to microbes. And well, we have to do that. And the more I thought about it, the more I started to see microbes absolutely everywhere. And that's like stating the obvious, because now we know that they are absolutely everywhere, but they just haven't really been the subject of social scientific research. So when I talk to my social sciences colleagues that, I'm developing this field of sociology of microbes, they just go like, huh? People first, when they think of social sciences or sociology, they think of kinship relationships, or they think of religion or politics or whatever. And I just think that, we really need to put the microbes into the picture. Meanwhile, I was also fermenting myself, first as a sort of as a way of preserving. I'm really passionate about gardening and permaculture gardening and allotment and growing my own food so as to kind of bypass industrial food production, and always was looking for ways in which I can store my yield, because suddenly it's like you have so much courgette that you cannot possibly eat any more courgette, and so what do you do with your courgette? And so then fermenting became one way of storing food. And then at some point, all of this started to kind of hang together as a sort of play with microbes, where fermentation for me is a method of really like tangibly seeing, or at least sensory way of experiencing the microbes. It's the closest I can get to kind of seeing their effects. I can taste them, I can smell them, I can see them, the liquid around the cucumbers, it bubbles and fizzes and it tastes different. So fermentation is for me like it's a method that I've been developing in order to, as a social scientist.
How you would describe this method, or how you would even describe maybe fermentation in that angle of like how you use it or how you approach it?
We've run these fermentation workshops where we come together with a group of people to do fermentation together, and then we sort of talk about the process of the chopping or the cutting or the vegetables, where they came from, the kinds of history of how they've been produced, and the line of agriculture or the industrial processing that food comes from, and how it is to be engaging with your food, like to the point that you're really making it rather than buying something ready-made. Or we might come together and engage with the traditions of that particular cuisine or food culture, or the legacy of the heritage of that particular kind of sourdough, for example, or the history of the vats or the tools for that. And often those workshops, it's in a way interestingly looping time, the present, the future. Most people have some kind of recollection of fermented products from their childhood, and yet those traditions have kind of stopped with modernization, or with supermarket foods and the convenience of convenience stores. And so they are sort of an interesting reinvigoration of past practices that now is very hipster, that they want to kind of learn again. And there's an increased interest in the health aspects and health benefits of microbes, that people who have felt the effects of industrialized foods, then they feel like they want to start to learn to make their own food, be self-sufficient, but also make healthy food rather than processed foods. So the workshops often bring people together that that sort of link between the past and the present in really interesting ways. In science and technology studies, there is a tradition where inanimate or non-human actors are considered actors or having sociality or being social, and need to be considered within as actors in a phenomenon that is being studied, or as an assemblage of a network. So the microbe there, by that definition, is a social actor in the process of fermentation. So if we look at what is a fermentation as the method, it's not just about people, it's about all the different kinds of or different actors coming together, whether they are human or more than human in this case. Alternatively, of course, you can the fermentation workshops are great opportunities for somehow doing social fermentation that is about people. So they provide a platform for talking about politics. I alluded to the food, the kind of industrial food. I alluded to maybe social relationships that are being brought together and kind of reconfiguring a space, which is a safe one where people can share and discuss whatever comes to their mind, and sometimes the discussions are pretty intense and politicized and personal, because people talk about their pasts and their experiences. So the workshops can be thought about in two ways. One with the microbes as the social actor, and then as being about the humans kind of coming together as in that fermentation mode. But I think the radicalness of the fermentation as a methodology is that the possibility of thinking about the microbes as a social category, a social actor there, and that's what I think is so exciting about doing the workshops.
To me, it's also like bringing three different scales working together. So there is this micro scale and microbes doing their job. Then this kind of a scale which probably is the most human scale, meaning like social relationship around food and food preparation. There's also a macro scale of the food systems and why they change so much and so on.
The politics of access to food and lack of access to food, and what kind of foods are supplemented, what the industrialized processes of selling certain kinds of goods. Yeah, absolutely.
Which is a scale which probably is still by many not so explored similarly as the microbes, because those are a scale which we cannot really perceive just by our senses. It's more like you need tools to kind of investigate both of the scales.
Yeah, I think this is a beautiful example of precisely that, that around the microbes you can bring those scales together, because the microbes are political there, and the political is microbial in a way. That attempt to get rid of microbes that had been the kind of the modern purist idea about microbes only being pathogenic had led to a very industrialized approach to microbes in food production, for example, so that there is only like 3 or 2 different strands of yeast, that is baker's yeast, that is being used vis-a-vis like hundreds of wild yeasts that you can bake with. And so the lack of diversity in microbes in food production, or the way in which good clean food is thought about, has led to lack of diversity in microbes that seems to be kind of diffracted through different fields of food production, or thinking about cleanliness and to a kind of an abiotic way of thinking about what is a sanitated environment, and what is a clean home, or what does it have to look like in order to look healthy. And there's always an assumption that the microbes are the microbial presence is a bad thing. And now in the light of the current knowledge, and of that microbes are abundant, and absolutely necessary for good healthy ecologies, both inside the gut and in the environment. So the microbes were in some ways sending a message about, like, hey guys, you have to slow down. You cannot overconsume. You cannot create these monocultures. You can't continue to extract from the environment, climate, air, water, soil, and continue to live like this without there being any terrible outcomes.
Western civilization often tries to impose monoculturalism and lack of diversity, not just in the micro world, but also in societies. Can we become more sensitive to these issues when we work with microbes?
I think we need to. You don't have to. It's not necessary to talk about microbes when talking about social justice and social change and the need for transformation, but you cannot have conversations about microbes without them. That would just be like a fun hobby. I think everything that we do has to, in some way, it has to address the politics and the privileges and the social justices and the activism, the everyday fight towards social change, be it Black Lives Matter or Me Too or what have you, the decolonizing practices. I think the times that we're living in, there cannot be an empty space that doesn't include political considerations, I feel. And microbes are not an exception in that sense. The possibility of talking about microbes in this kind of way, that they are health producing, or that they are even that it is okay that these are products that are okay to eat, in as much as anything is okay to eat and is healthy and will make you happy and so on. This is all luxury enabled by certain healthcare infrastructures and access to healthcare. I think the possibility, the framing or an option to think about microbes in this way is a privilege, in that there are people to whom it's not at all self-evident that microbes are their friends, but they still continue to suffer from very curable infectious diseases, but simply because they don't have healthcare access. That is definitely something that I think about. So what is the kind of the macro protection that enables a space that where it's possible for us to even be playing with microbes in this way, rather than die out of a pandemic that is upon us. Having said that, it's not always straightforward how the lines of injustice are drawn, in the sense that the new research shows that an over-sanitated way of relating to microbes is actually also detrimental.
As we were talking before, that microbes related topics are parts of bigger systems like healthcare, food systems, which also has a history of being extremely oppressive.
Mm.
And then industrialization of food production or access to healthcare are also a big part of injustice in the societies, right? And inequalities.
Yeah, there is work by scholars that include Donna Haraway and Singh, Scott Gilbert and others, who've talked about plantation scene, where the plantation was the way in which land and labor were organized that required people and seeds being brought from outside to create these plantations, monocultures, that they required labor and that resulted in slavery. And the idea, the logic with which these plantations were organized were based on dominion over or power over both land and people. What we talked about, the macro structures, is already through and through embedded in the way in which people relate to think about food, think about labor, think about microbes, that where both microbes and people were controlled and manipulated, and bringing them from outside, creating these single monocrop systems meant that it was possible to produce huge amounts of food, but it was always with power over and at the expense of people's freedoms, or at the expense of relationships and circular relationships or embedded ecological relationships with land and plant world and food and animals. As long as we're thinking in those terms of dominion over or harnessing objects, be they microbial or humans, to our work, then that those inequalities are just not going to go away. But in order, we have to really rethink the hierarchies, rethink human dominion over nature. But thinking about the rights of the more than human, the rights of land, rights of, it's not mutually exclusive with human rights, but they have to all be addressed together at the same time. It can't be that we think of the people issues first and then we think of the environment, and we can't think of the environment and then get to the human rights, but it all has to go in tandem. And it really has to happen, because the microbes are pushing back.
I wanted maybe to turn more into this like essential part of fermentation. So maybe come back to maybe your favorite tastes related to fermentation, or favorite recipes.
One of the things that has blown my mind is that once you start thinking about food from the perspective of microbes, or fermentation rather, you realize that so many of the things that are around us are actually fermented. Like, so many things that we don't even think about. Chocolate, coffee, etc. I mean, so even like very basic, daily ingredients have been fermented in the process. I think one of the things that fermented food has done, likewise has done foraging, is that they've expanded my palate. I feel like fermentation and foraging have just opened me up to flavors that I would have not thought about as tasty, or I wouldn't even like, they would just be like a bit too much in terms of the bitterness, or in terms of the acidity or the sourness or the tartness. I don't necessarily even have words for the kinds of flavor complexities that then both foraging and fermentation have sort of allowed me to explore and start to really love and crave. One of my favorite Indian fermented dishes is idlis, like so fermented, sort of UFO-shaped cakes made of rice and moong dal, and it's the flour, they've grounded the flour, and then the batter is fermented, and then they're steamed, and you eat that with dal and different kinds of vegetables. That would be one. Or dosa, which is a similar kind of batter, but it's sold as a flat pancake, like a crepe type, but it's savory and not sweet, and rolled into with potatoes and vegetables inside. So that's also amazing. Fermented bamboo shoots, amazing. Of the things that I make myself, those are all amazing things, but I claim no mastery over them. The ones that I make myself, I love perhaps most pickled cucumbers, fermented cucumbers. So very, very everyday, and nothing tricky, nothing that will require anything more complicated than chopping your cucumbers into quarters and throwing all the spices that you kind of have at that point in time, and then salt water, and yet from such something so simple becomes something so amazingly rich and complex and amazing. Yeah, sauerkraut also good, but I think the cucumbers have an added structure that I find amazing. I also make a lot of sourdough, and my earliest memories of fermentation come from my grandmother making sourdough and viili. And she would make, it comes from northern Ostrobothnia, and she would make like a barrel vat of, I don't know, 50 liters of dough every couple of weeks during the summer, and she would flip the entire tabletop over, and there was 10 children, and then all the adults, and so you can imagine how much bread they ate. And so she would ferment that whole barrel. My grandfather would heat up the oven, which was this traditional Finnish bread oven, and then my grandma would roll. We, as the kids, we could use a glass
to cut
the hole in the middle, and we got to eat the round bit that was left over, and then she also made the big lumps and not the ones with the hole in the middle. But I specifically remember that it was our job to do either poke holes into them with the fork to kind of allow the air bubbles to come out, and then cut out the center part with the glass. And to eat that with butter is possibly like the best thing that I still think that in terms of what is amazingness and wholesomeness and comfort foodness is warm rye bread with butter. I don't get to eat that so much anymore, but it is perhaps the best thing in the world.
And this is really the last question.
Yeah.
What do you hope for the future? Because you also do the research, which I think it is very much, I think, related to social change, and also bringing back this kind of micro attention and to the lives of people. What do you hope for in relation to that? How this relationship should change?
I think on the meta level, I want to have more of these, continue to have more of these discussions of the macro and the micro. And I think the macro is not just, I mean, in that the political is always embedded. So industrial food production, who has access to what foods, what kinds of, who's left out of what kinds of foods, who's left out of access to healthcare. These are all really political questions and discussions. And so I think there's a need to think about the circularity of those scales, that microbes and people and the political structures kind of connect or bring together. And so I want to continue to have those conversations across with people working in different disciplines. So the work that we do on antimicrobial resistance, for example, trying to create some kind of social change that is not just about the social as an intervention to discussions, but really thinking about, are there ways in which we can create knowledge that would illuminate where the risks of where antimicrobial resistance spreads in low resource communities. I think altogether, the fermentation and the work on the antimicrobial resistance comes together under this heading of thinking about post-antibiotic worlds. So what are all the things in this everyday life, in lots of different places, contexts, and practices that have to change in order to imagine what life would be where we don't rely on antibiotics, where we don't rely on thinking about microbes as a threat. Obviously, there are microbes who are pathogenic and cause diseases in certain circumstances for certain people. But so how do we ensure that the antibiotics work in those circumstances? And how do we make sure that they're not used in ways in which aren't absolutely necessary? So how do we create relationships with animals where animals are not fed antibiotics in order to fatten them up for human consumption? I mean, that's just one example, small example, but there are so many things that have to change. There's loads of things that have to change in order to get to a point where we don't rely on antibiotics or just roll them out in situations where they're not actually necessary. And part of that change has to do with human relationships and imaginaries about antibiotics. And so I want to be part of that discussion on a meta and very practical level. What will a post-antibiotic world look like?
While we talk in the room, I think there are 2 flies. So we are 2 in a room and 2 flies with us. And I'm pretty sure they will be recorded on the audio. But I'm also thinking this fits the topic. Like, let's get rid of this clean, sound. Let's have some other beings doing their stuff too in the room. So I think it's a good background. I don't know, dialogue they have here flying around. Okay,
and like
thank you
clean
so
sound.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Not clean sound. So whether flies or bacteria or microbes, whatever, yeah, it's all there. Hey, thank you so much,
Pleasure.
Salla.